now that Peter is back at the fire, and it was mentioned that the maid saw him, Matthew continues, chapter 26:71. There is the maid. I use another and saw him. That maid in italics, I don't use it, but I think I need it here, because the next part begins, and said to them that were there. Who? Well, clearly it's the maid, but because I separated the fact that the maid saw him and that he's now warming himself, which I had to because Matthew and Mark are pretty clear. He's at the porch when he was seen. But in John, it's clear that he's standing with the servants and officers warming himself. So because of that, I need to re-mention who it is that's speaking. So I'm going to put this maid at the beginning. And the maid said to them that were there. But now I need the word the. Mark 14:69. And began to say to them that stood by. So again, I need to add the maid began to say to them that stood by. I have maid, I need the word the. Luke, I already used, and after a little while, another saw him. Just and said. So now I need to reintroduce who this is. I'm not going to say another again, because that would seem like it's a third. John has verse 25. They said therefore to him. Unfortunately, that word, the, is not in this verse. Here in Matthew. A few verses earlier, it says, then they spit on his face, buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands. I could use that one. In Mark, earlier, verse 65, and some began to spit on him, and to cover his face, and to buffet him, and to say to him, prophesy, and the servants did strike him with the palms of their hands. So I could use either one of those. Matthew has the palms of their hands. Mark, the palms of their hands. I could just use one of the words there and move the other here. Luke, Jesus is treated badly later after all of Peter's denials. Verse 64, and when they had blindfolded him, they struck him and spit on his face and asked him, saying, prophesy. I'll just do what I thought earlier. I'll take one of the words the palms of their hands from Mark, and Matthew, the palms of their hands. I'll use the word the from Mark. You might think it's too much of a reach, but the meaning is still there. I have to re-explain who it is that's speaking. I mentioned the maid earlier, another maid. I spoke back of where Peter was, that he had made some movement back to the fire, Now I need to reintroduce who's speaking. I can't just say "and said," because then you'd think this is Peter. It says, he again warmed himself and stood with the servants there and warmed themselves. They warmed themselves. So if I just said "and said," you'd think it could be the servants and officers, but no, they don't start this. The maid starts this statement. So I have to reintroduce her. I know that I'm going to begin from Luke, Matthew, and from Mark. And Mark thee. So I have Maid, and that's only Matthew. It is in italics, but I need it. Said to them that were there. That's Matthew. Mark began to say to them that stood by. Luke said. Matthew and Luke have said, but Mark seems to be more interesting. Began to say to them that stood by. I think I'm going to go with that because this accusation goes around from her to them and then from them to him. So she begins it. I'm going to put began to say. So that's Mark. Again, to say is only Mark. And to them is both Matthew and Mark. That stood by. Matthew, that were there. I'm going to go with stood because it's already explained that the servants and the officers are standing by the fire. So if I keep that word stood, it'll force you to recognize who this group is she's talking to. The servants and officers. And instead of just stood by, I'm going to go with stood there. Because that would be even better. He warmed himself and stood with the servants and the officers there. So both of those words, stood and there, if I reuse them, will again force you to recognize it's this same group. Matthew, this fellow was also, I already used with, Jesus of Nazareth. So this fellow was also. So I could say one of them. Mark, this is one of them. This fellow was also one of them. I could say was also one of them or is also one of them. Luke has you are also one of them. But I'm going to add that you to the question from John where they say, are not you also one of his disciples? Are, present. Only Matthew has was, past tense. Mark, Luke, and John all seem to be present. You are one of them. So I'm going to go with that. I'll go with is instead of was from Mark. This is one of them. This fellow. Fellow is in italics. I could put it. Yeah, I think it does help because if I don't have the words in italics, it would just say this is of them. Because one is also in italics. But if I have them both, this fellow is one of them. That actually helps explain a whole lot more. She's speaking to them, so then they add, are not you also one? That one is also in italics. One of his disciples. Then I'll put who he is. Jesus of Nazareth at the end. This from Matthew and Mark. Fellow from Matthew is one from Mark. Mark and Luke of them. This fellow is one of them. Where I put Maid, I did have Matthew with italics, and then up here I had Mark where it said maid. But it makes more sense to have where it says and the maid. The word the is not in italics, so it doesn't make any sense to have originally written and the began to say, so the translators add the word maid. I mean, no one would have wrote the sentence and the began to say. You would name who the person is, the maid. So I added the actual word maid there just so that it's not confusing. And then up here, it does make sense for there to be no word there, but then it to be added to explain, because it said another saw him. That's actually how it's written originally. And when he was gone out into the porch, another maid in italics saw him. It makes perfect sense that way. And Luke, and after a little while, another saw him. So it does make sense to have the added word here after another. It doesn't make sense to have it after the word the, which is actually written. So I switched those two, and I think it's better that way. And the maid began to say to them that stood there, this fellow is one of them.